The rain was relentless that night in Manhattan, slicing through the city like shards of glass. Inside a small, sterile hospital room at New York Presbyterian, fluorescent lights hummed over the metallic bed where Grace Miller, 27, gasped for air. Her blood pressure was soaring. Monitors screamed warnings. The doctor barked orders while a nurse tightened a cuff around her trembling arm. Grace's swollen hands clutched her belly, two tiny lives fighting inside her. Her husband, Cole Harrington, stood by the window, staring at his iPhone. The screen lit up with a name he couldn't ignore, Sloan Pierce. His pulse raced for all the wrong reasons. The rain hammered harder, masking the vibration of his guilt. "Cole," Grace whispered weakly, "don't leave. I'm scared." He didn't answer. He pressed the phone to his ear, voice low. "She's in labor." "No, it's complicated." "Yeah, I'll come." Then he turned to the nurse and lied, "I'll be right back." He wasn't coming back. Downstairs, his Mercedes S-Class idled beneath the emergency awning, wipers slapping in rhythm with thunder. The driver glanced in the mirror as Cole slid in, soaked and shaking. "Just drive," Cole muttered. The city blurred past, neon, rain, regret. Behind him, the storm roared as Grace's oxygen mask fogged with every desperate breath. Dr. Maya Chen, the attending OB, rushed in. "She's crashing. We need to move now." The surgical team wheeled Grace toward the operating room. IV lines, trailing like lifelines. Grace tried to speak, but words drowned in panic. "Please, save my babies," she managed before the anesthesia mask covered her face. On the highway, Cole's phone buzzed again. Sloan sending a selfie in front of a midtown lounge, her lipstick flawless. "You made the right choice," the caption read. Cole's jaw tightened. He told himself this was freedom, that Grace was only a mistake of youth. He couldn't stand hospitals, couldn't handle weakness. The truth, he couldn't stand responsibility. Inside the OR, Maya's gloves moved fast. "Clamp, suction, heart rate dropping," she shouted. A nurse prayed under her breath. Then, two cries pierced the storm. First thin and uncertain, then stronger. Maya exhaled, whispering, "Welcome to the world, little fighters." Grace stirred in recovery, disoriented. The first thing she saw was the window, lightning cutting across the sky. "Where's Cole?" she asked. No one answered. A nurse glanced away, unable to lie. Grace turned her head. Two incubators stood nearby, glowing softly under the blue NICU light. Her babies were breathing. That should have been enough. But her heart fractured anyway. Hours later, rain eased into drizzle. Cole stood outside Sloan's apartment on Fifth Avenue, his shirt still damp. She opened the door wearing his favorite scent. "You did it," she whispered, pulling him in. "Now nothing's in our way." Cole nodded, though something in him trembled. Somewhere across the city, two tiny heartbeats echoed through the monitors. His children, alive and waiting for a father who had already walked away. At dawn, the camera would linger on Grace's hospital bracelet, still wet with tears, engraved with 3 barcodes, hers and 2 marked Baby A and Baby B. Her fingers traced them softly, whispering, "You'll never be alone." Thunder rolled once more above Manhattan, fading into morning. And Cole Harrington didn't know that the storm he ran from tonight would return 9 months later, under the chandeliers of the Plaza Hotel, when those same twins would walk into his wedding. The NICU was a world of quiet miracles and steady beeps. Tiny bodies wrapped in wires and tubes, glowing softly under warmers. Grace Miller lay weak on her hospital bed, eyes fixed on the 2 incubators in front of her. "Baby A and Baby B," the nurse said gently. Both breathing on their own, but were monitoring oxygen levels closely. Grace's lips trembled as she whispered, "Thank God." Dr. Maya Chen entered, her face calm but eyes exhausted. "They're fighters, Grace. So are you. But your blood pressure is still high. You need rest." Grace tried to smile, but the pain wasn't just physical. Her wedding band felt like ice on her finger. She stared at the door, half expecting Cole to walk through it with flowers or guilt. He didn't. By noon, a nurse brought a tray of bland soup and an envelope from billing. "We're having issues verifying your insurance," she said carefully. Grace frowned. "It's under my husband's employer plan, Harrington Capital." The nurse bit her lip. "It was canceled this morning." That's when Aunt Linda appeared, raincoat dripping, clutching 2 paper cups from Starbucks. "My poor girl," she sighed, setting 1 cup beside Grace. "I took the subway soon as I heard. Where's that husband of yours?" Grace swallowed hard. "He left." Linda's eyes sharpened. "Left where?" Grace turned away. "Just left." The next hour was a blur of phone calls and panic. Grace tried reaching Cole, but every call went straight to voicemail. A message finally arrived, a single text bubble. "We should separate. It's better for both of us." Linda read it over her shoulder, jaw tightening. "Better for who?" she muttered. Later that evening, attorney Samuel Price, a pro bono family lawyer recommended by the hospital, arrived. He looked out of place among the pastel walls and newborn cries, tall gray suit carrying a battered briefcase. "Mrs. Miller," he said, pulling up a chair. "Under EMTALA, the hospital can't discharge you or the babies for non-payment. We'll stabilize insurance and file for emergency spousal support." Grace nodded weakly, clutching the edge of her blanket. "I don't want his money. I just want my babies safe." Samuel looked at her kindly. "Safety costs money. Let's make him pay what he owes." That night, Maya returned, setting a small paperback on Grace's tray, a copy of Atomic Habits someone had left in the family lounge. "One page a night," she said softly, "helps rewire the mind." Grace traced the title, wondering how to rebuild anything from ashes. In another part of Manhattan, Cole sat in a dim bar with Sloane Pierce, his polished reflection gleaming off the mirrored wall. She brushed his sleeve. "You did the right thing," she whispered. "That life wasn't you." He forced a smile, staring at the Rolex on his wrist as if it could measure morality. A camera flashed somewhere behind them. The next morning, the photo surfaced online. Harrington Air spotted with PR executive at Midtown Lounge. Cole scrolled past it, pretending not to care. Back at the hospital, Grace watched dawn creep through the blinds. She recorded a quiet voice memo on her phone, her first message to her newborns. "You were born during a storm," she said softly. "But the world is calm now. Mommy's here." The babies stirred in their warmers, tiny fists rising as if reaching for her voice. A nurse smiled from the doorway. "They know you're near," she whispered. Grace smiled faintly, unaware that outside the NICU window, a tabloid van idled at the curb, engine running, camera lens trained upward, waiting to capture the woman their headlines would soon call the abandoned wife. And far across the city, in a penthouse on Fifth Avenue, Cole Harrington was already planning a new life, without realizing that the one he'd just discarded was about to define him forever. Morning sunlight leaked through the hospital blinds, too bright for how broken Grace Miller felt. Her twins slept in their NICU cribs, wires like spider threads against their pink skin. She whispered a prayer, tracing the glass with her fingertip. Outside, life went on. Cars honking, coffee cups clinking, but her world had stopped. Attorney Samuel Price returned that morning, his briefcase stuffed with documents. "We're filing for temporary spousal support and insurance reinstatement," he explained. "Cole's lawyers will try to discredit you, say you're unstable, or that the babies might not be his." Grace's mouth fell open. "He knows they're his." Samuel's expression softened. "He's protecting his reputation, not the truth." Later, a nurse placed a small DNA test kit on her tray. "Court order," she murmured. Grace's hands trembled as she swabbed each baby's cheek, sealing their futures inside paper envelopes. The sound of the tape closing felt like a door locking behind her. By evening, Aunt Linda helped her pack what little she owned into 2 hospital bags. Grace couldn't afford another night there. They took a yellow cab to Linda's small apartment in Queens. 1 bedroom, a cracked window, and a heart big enough to hold 3. The apartment smelled of chamomile tea and detergent. Linda tucked the twins into a thrifted bassinet, humming softly. "It's not the Plaza Hotel," she said with a smile, "but love's free." Grace laughed weakly. The room was cramped, but it was safe. On the shelf ticked a citizen watch, the only thing that hadn't stopped in weeks. At 3 a.m., one baby began to wheeze. Grace jolted awake, fumbling with the suction bulb, her mind racing. Linda guided her, calm and sure. "You'll learn," she said. "Mothers always do." When the infant finally settled, Grace collapsed onto the couch, tears mixing with milk stains on her robe. She felt invisible, but also alive. Meanwhile, across town in a glass tower overlooking Park Avenue, Cole Harrington was all smiles. Dressed in a tailored navy suit, he entered his father's boardroom with a confidence that wasn't earned. Richard Harrington, silver-haired and stern, sat at the head of the table, Mont Blanc pen tapping on a folder. "I heard you left the hospital mid-crisis," Richard said. "That doesn't play well, son." Cole forced a laugh. "It's over, Dad. She'll be fine. I'm moving on." Richard eyed him. Moving on doesn't mean running away. The company's image is fragile. Cole shrugged. So is marriage. The words hung in the air, heavy as lead. Richard dismissed him with a cold glance. Minutes later, Cole met Sloane Pierce in the company's PR suite. She wore a silk blouse and a victory smile. "The press loves our story," she whispered, scrolling through her iPad. "Rebrand. Two people who found love after heartbreak." Cole kissed her. "Let's make it official soon." Back in Queens, Grace's phone buzzed. The DNA results had arrived. Her hands shook as she opened the email. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. Relief collided with rage. She whispered, "You can't erase them now." Linda looked up from folding laundry. "What is it?" Grace turned the screen around. "Proof." That same evening, social media lit up. Sloane posted a photo, her hand wearing a Tiffany & Co. ring, captioned, "Forever starts now." Grace's stomach twisted, but she didn't cry. She looked at her babies sleeping side by side and whispered, "You are my forever." Outside, sirens wailed through the city, echoing through the cracked window like a warning. Grace didn't know it yet, but those results were more than evidence. They were the first weapon in the quiet war for justice that was about to begin. And somewhere high above Park Avenue, Cole Harrington poured champagne, believing he had won, while fate was already writing his downfall in ink he couldn't wash away. A week later, the spring air over Queens felt almost kind. The twins were stronger now, their cries louder, their lungs fighting back against the world. Grace Miller sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by unpaid bills and formula cans. A knock startled her. Samuel Price, always precise in a gray suit, stepped inside holding a manila envelope. "Cole's attorney sent a settlement," he said, dropping it onto the table. "A check for $50,000 and a non-disclosure agreement. You take it. You waive all rights to public claims, support, and acknowledgement." Grace stared at the papers. "So he buys silence?" Samuel nodded. "It's what men like him do when they're scared." Aunt Linda crossed her arms. "Tell him to shove his check where the sun don't shine." Grace exhaled, torn between pride and exhaustion. 50,000 could cover rent, childcare, medicine, things her babies needed now. "I don't want charity," she whispered. Samuel corrected softly. "It's not charity. It's hush money. There's a difference." The next morning at the New York Presbyterian NICU, Dr. Maya Chen found Grace in the hallway. "You shouldn't be back on shift yet," Maya said, glancing at the chart in Grace's trembling hands. "I can't sit home and think," Grace answered. "Work keeps me breathing." Maya smiled gently. "Then at least let someone help you." Help arrived that afternoon in a way Grace didn't expect. A quiet man in a dark navy suit approached her at the hospital cafeteria. He looked familiar from news articles. Ethan Caldwell, the tech investor whose company had funded new NICU incubators. "Miss Miller?" he said kindly. "I heard what happened. Dr. Chen told me a little." Grace stiffened. "If this is another donation story, please don't." Ethan shook his head. "Not a story. Just logistics. The foundation has a childcare grant for NICU nurses. Flexible scheduling, small stipends, no conditions. I thought you might qualify." Grace frowned. "Why me?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Because you keep showing up. That counts." He set his Mont Blanc pen on a form and signed the sponsorship slip. Grace's eyes welled, but she blinked it away. "Thank you," she whispered. "It's not pity," he said softly. "It's infrastructure." Later that night, in Cole's new Fifth Avenue penthouse, champagne sparkled in crystal flutes. Sloane Pierce lounged on a velvet sofa, scrolling through a digital mock-up. Harrington Pierce wedding, the Plaza Grand Ballroom. "Imagine," she said dreamily. "Press everywhere, flowers, a rooftop after-party." Cole leaned back, smirking. "The city will finally see who I really am." A notification buzzed. An email from his lawyer. "DNA results confirmed. Client advised to maintain discretion." Cole deleted it instantly. "Doesn't change anything," he muttered. Back in Queens, Grace held her babies under the soft light of a borrowed lamp. The twins' tiny hands wrapped around her finger like anchors. Linda brewed tea, humming low. "You could take that money," she said, voice gentle. "No shame in making them pay." Grace looked down at her sons. "If I take his money, he owns the silence. I want him to hear them one day, hear what he left." Maya texted later that night. "You did good today. Ethan asked about you." "He's interesting." Grace smiled for the first time in months. Maybe kindness wasn't extinct after all. Across the skyline, Cole posted a picture. He and Sloane standing under the Plaza Hotel's golden chandeliers, captioned, "Forever begins here." Comments flooded in, "Power couple, fairy tale love." Grace closed her phone and whispered to her sons, "We'll write our own story." Then the next morning, an embossed letter arrived at Linda's mailbox. From Richard Harrington, Chairman, Harrington Capital. Subject, meeting request. And for the first time since the storm, Grace realized someone in that powerful family might finally be listening. The city was waking up as Grace Miller crossed the Queensboro Bridge, clutching a worn canvas bag and a lunchbox. The twins were with Aunt Linda, asleep in their bassinets. Her body still ached from childbirth, but she was back in her pale blue scrubs, badge clipped to her chest. Registered nurse, NICU. The hospital doors slid open, and for the first time in months, she felt the smell of disinfectant as something like home. Her colleagues greeted her cautiously, with that soft pity reserved for tragedies whispered in break rooms. Grace smiled politely, refusing their sympathy. She just wanted to work. The hum of monitors, the beep of tiny hearts, this was where she still belonged. In the locker room, Dr. Maya Chen handed her a coffee. "You sure you're ready?" Grace nodded. "I need to be." Maya hesitated. "There's something you should know." She pulled out her phone and showed Grace a headline, "Harrington Heir Plans Grand Plaza Wedding." The photo showed Cole Harrington and Sloane Pierce, flawless smiles beneath the chandeliers of the Plaza Hotel. Grace felt her stomach twist but managed a steady breath. "Good for them," she said flatly. At lunch, attorney Samuel Price called. "I filed for support. Expect their legal team to stall. Don't panic." Grace sighed. "I don't care about money." Samuel's tone hardened. "It's not about money, it's acknowledgement. He can't erase you." She hung up, staring at her reflection in the cafeteria window. Tired eyes, soft determination. That evening, she returned to Linda's apartment. The twins cooed, reaching for her face. Linda handed her a note. "From that fancy man, Ethan Caldwell." Grace frowned and unfolded the letter. It wasn't romantic, just a short thank you. "The foundation covered your childcare grant. Keep going." At the bottom was a line in neat handwriting. "Courage is quieter than fear." Linda smirked. "He sounds like a good man." Grace smiled faintly. "Good men are extinct." Linda laughed. "Then you found a rare one." Meanwhile, across Park Avenue, in the mirrored conference rooms of Harrington Capital, Cole tried on his best performance. He sat beside Sloane at a meeting with PR executives and event planners. Screens projected floral arrangements, champagne lists, and designer invitations. "The Plaza wants exclusive photo rights," Sloane said excitedly. Cole nodded but barely listened. His father, Richard Harrington, entered, silent authority wrapped in a tailored charcoal suit. "Son," Richard said slowly, "the board is concerned about your past decisions." Cole smirked. "The past is behind me." Richard placed a file on the table, Grace's name printed on the first page. "Some things don't stay buried." Cole's jaw tightened. "You're siding with her?" Richard met his gaze. "I'm siding with integrity. This family doesn't build empires on betrayal." The words sliced deeper than he expected. Later that night, Grace sat on the couch, rocking one baby while the other slept beside her. The hum of the fridge filled the silence. Suddenly her phone buzzed, an unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "Mrs. Miller," a calm male voice said. "This is Richard Harrington. I'd like to meet discreetly." Grace froze. "Why?" "I believe you deserve fairness," he said. "And my grandson deserves a name." Her heart pounded. "Tomorrow," he added. "The River Cafe, 10 a.m. After the call ended, Grace stared at the twins. "Grandson," she whispered, letting the word roll through her chest. Linda entered with a towel over her shoulder. "Everything okay?" Grace nodded, though her hands shook. "He wants to meet." "Who?" Linda asked. "His father," Grace said quietly. "The real one." Outside, the lights of Manhattan shimmered across the East River like promises written in gold. And Grace didn't know it yet, but that meeting would ignite a war between truth and blood that no amount of money could silence. The next morning, Manhattan shimmered beneath a soft fog rising from the East River. Grace Miller wore her plain gray coat, the same one she'd owned since nursing school, as she walked toward the River Cafe in Brooklyn. The world around her felt too polished for someone whose hands were cracked from sanitizer and sleepless nights. Inside, every glass and plate sparkled like it belonged to a different life. At a corner table sat Richard Harrington, his presence sharp as steel in a tailored navy suit. He stood when she approached, offering a hand. "Grace," he said quietly, "thank you for coming." His voice carried the weight of boardrooms and headlines. She sat opposite him, her heartbeat loud in her ears. "Why am I here, Mr. Harrington?" He adjusted his cufflinks before speaking. "Because my son is about to make a public spectacle, and I won't have the Harrington name dragged through filth. I believe what happened to you was unforgivable." Grace blinked, stunned. "So this is about reputation." He hesitated. "Partly, but also about what's right. Those boys are my blood." Grace's hands tightened around her coffee cup. "Blood doesn't make a father." Richard nodded slowly. "No, but perhaps it can repair what's left." He slid a small velvet box across the table. Not jewelry, but 2 tiny Cartier bracelets engraved with initials, AH and BH. "For their trust fund," he said. "No strings, you don't owe us silence." Grace exhaled shakily. "I'm not for sale." His expression didn't change. "Good, I hoped you'd say that." Then he handed her a heavy envelope. Inside was a wedding invitation embossed in gold. Cole Harrington and Sloane Pierce, the Plaza Hotel, Grand Ballroom. Grace stared at it, confused. "Why would you give me this?" Richard leaned back. "Because you deserve to see how liars dress up their sins. Attend if you wish, speak if you must. Just know, truth has a way of echoing in rooms built for applause." She didn't answer. Back in Queens, Aunt Linda nearly tore the invitation in half. "That viper's nest? You're not setting one foot there." Attorney Samuel Price disagreed. "You should. Public acknowledgement matters in court. One appearance, one photograph, it changes the narrative." Grace rubbed her temples. "I'm not a headline." Maya called that evening. "You don't have to prove you survived," she said softly. "You already did." But when Grace hung up, she stared at the invitation again. The date shimmered in gold. September 9th, exactly 9 months after the twins' birth. The symmetry burned into her mind. Later, as she rocked her babies to sleep, her phone buzzed. A message from Ethan Caldwell. "Heard about the invitation. If you go, I can provide security discreetly. You shouldn't walk into that room alone." Grace smiled faintly. "Thank you, but I won't go." She typed the words, then deleted them. Across the city, the Plaza's ballroom buzzed with rehearsals. Sloane twirled beneath the chandeliers, practicing her smile for photographers. "It's going to be perfect," she said. Cole adjusted his cufflinks, pretending confidence. But when he opened the guest list, his smirk faltered. "Why is she invited?" he muttered. Richard's assistant replied calmly, "Per your father's request." That night, Grace laid the invitation on the kitchen table, beside a baby monitor and a bottle warmer. She stared at it until the letters blurred. Then, slowly, she took a pen and circled the RSVP line. Her handwriting was steady when she wrote, "Attending, +2. Linda gasped. "Grace, no." Grace folded the envelope. "This isn't revenge," she said quietly. "It's recognition." The city outside hummed with traffic and secrets. Somewhere uptown, Cole rehearsed vows about honesty, unaware that the truth was already on its way, cradled in the arms of the woman he'd abandoned. And under the golden lights of the Plaza Hotel, his past was waiting for an invitation to walk right through the front door. The chandeliers of the Plaza Hotel burned like captured stars. Crystal glimmered on every table, the air thick with perfume and ambition. Reporters drifted through the marble lobby, rehearsing their headlines, the power wedding of the year. But beneath the glitter, there was unease. Cole Harrington, tailored in black Armani, stood at the center of it all, running a hand through his perfect hair. "Again," he snapped at the planner. "Make sure the press sees the ring before the vows." Sloane Pierce, his bride-to-be, twirled in her rehearsal gown. "Relax, baby," she purred. "Tomorrow, everyone forgets that storm and that woman." Her voice dripped with contempt. Cole forced a smirk. "They already have." At that same hour, in a small Queens apartment, Grace Miller dressed her twins in soft gray outfits, hands trembling with purpose. Aunt Linda packed extra formula and wipes into a tote. "You still have time to back out," Linda murmured. Grace shook her head. "No more hiding. The truth deserves to breathe." Attorney Samuel Price arrived minutes later with a small folder. "Legal filings, DNA results, notarized copies. You'll hand them to me when we're inside. Everything stays controlled." He paused. "Grace, remember, you don't have to speak unless you choose to." "I choose to exist," she replied simply. Meanwhile, Ethan Caldwell watched the preparations unfold from the mezzanine balcony of the plaza. He wasn't part of the guest list. His foundation was sponsoring the floral arrangements for the ballroom, but his real purpose was quiet observation. When Grace had accepted his offer for discreet security, he'd assigned 2 plainclothes agents to the event. No confrontations, he told them, only protection. Downstairs, Richard Harrington arrived for the rehearsal dinner. His presence silenced the room. "I'll speak first," he said to the coordinator. "The family toast must remind the public what Harrington means. Legacy, not gossip." Cole straightened, eager for approval. "Of course, Dad." Richard's gaze lingered. "Don't thank me yet." As the string quartet began to play, the ballroom shimmered. Cole rehearsed his vows under his breath. "Sloan, you are my redemption, my future." The words felt rehearsed, hollow. Sloan clung to his arms, smiling for invisible cameras. Across the hall, Ethan leaned against a column, unnoticed. He pulled out his phone and texted Grace. "Everything's set. Come tomorrow at noon. You'll be safe." Her reply came seconds later. "See you there." That night, Grace couldn't sleep. The invitation sat on the table beside her twins' bassinets. She touched each baby's cheek and whispered, "Tomorrow we tell the world who you are." In the penthouse suite above the plaza, Sloan rehearsed her entrance in front of a full-length mirror. "Do you think she'll try something?" she asked, pretending not to care. Cole snorted. "She wouldn't dare. She's nothing." Sloan arched a brow. "Funny. Nothing doesn't trend for weeks." She tossed a Dior lipstick onto the counter. "You sure this won't backfire?" Cole poured himself bourbon. Dad invited her to look merciful. She'll never show up. Downstairs, Richard's assistant handed him a sealed envelope, Grace's RSVP. He opened it slowly. The handwriting was delicate but certain. "Attending, +2. Richard's jaw tightened. "Good," he murmured. "It's time my son learned consequence." Morning bled into chaos. Photographers lined Fifth Avenue, limousines gliding beneath the gilded awning, news vans crowded the sidewalk. "Harrington wedding, exclusive access," banners read. Inside, Cole adjusted his cufflinks one last time. Then his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Congratulations on your big day. From the woman you left behind." Cole froze, throat dry. Outside, a sleek Mercedes Sprinter van pulled to the curb. The driver stepped out and opened the door. Grace emerged first, calm and steady, carrying one infant carrier. Ethan followed, lifting the other. Linda walked behind them, eyes firm. The crowd turned, cameras clicking like thunder. And as the doorman swung open the golden doors of the Plaza Hotel, every whisper, every lie, every cruel headline finally met its reckoning. Because Grace Miller, the wife he left to die, had just arrived at his wedding, the revolving doors of the Plaza Hotel spun slowly, as if even time itself hesitated to let Grace Miller inside. The rain outside softened into mist, glistening on the marble steps. Every flash from the cameras carved her silhouette against the gold-trimmed entrance, a quiet storm in gray silk. In her arms, one baby slept. The other blinked curiously, small fingers curled around her thumb. Ethan Caldwell stepped beside her, adjusting the stroller handle with a calm precision that steadied the air. "Remember," he whispered, "you're not here to fight. You're here to be seen." Aunt Linda followed, clutching the diaper bag like armor. "Let them choke on their diamonds," she muttered. Inside, the lobby shimmered under chandeliers the size of constellations. The sound of the quartet drifted from the ballroom, violins weaving a romantic lie. Every guest who turned saw her, gasping, whispering, cameras lifting like weapons. At the center of it all stood Cole Harrington, frozen mid-laugh beside Sloan Pierce. His smile cracked as if carved from glass. The champagne flute trembled in his hand. "No," he breathed, almost inaudible. Sloan's eyes widened. "What is she doing here?" Richard Harrington, seated near the dais, rose slowly. "I invited her," he said, voice steady as thunder rolling across a plain. The crowd silenced. Cole spun toward his father. "You did what?" Richard's gaze didn't waver. "You left her for dead, Cole. The least you can do is face the living." Grace walked forward. Every step echoed through marble, quiet but deliberate. The band stopped playing. Even the chandeliers seemed to hum with tension. Samuel Price appeared from the side corridor, handing her a sealed folder. Court filings, DNA results, truth in black ink. Grace's voice, when it came, was calm. "Congratulations," she said, meeting Cole's stunned eyes. "You look happy." He stammered. You shouldn't be here." She tilted her head. "Neither should ghosts, but here we are." The guests exchanged bewildered looks. Sloan forced a brittle laugh. "This is ridiculous. Someone remove her." No one moved. Even the hotel staff froze. Grace gently set one carrier down. The baby cooed, soft and innocent. The sound carried across the hall. Fragile, undeniable life. Cole's throat tightened. For a fleeting second, something human flickered behind his arrogance. Then fear returned, sharp and greedy. "This is a stunt," he said, voice shaking. "She's trying to humiliate me." Grace's expression didn't change. "No, Cole. You already did that yourself." Ethan stepped forward slightly, not as a savior, but as witness. The reporters, sensing a story worth millions, began snapping pictures. Sloane hissed under her breath, "You planned this. You wanted her to crash the wedding." Richard answered coldly, "No, Sloane. I wanted my grandchildren to meet their grandfather." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Grandchildren? Twins. A symphony of disbelief. Samuel opened the envelope and handed it to Richard. "Verified paternity results," he said loudly, his tone precise as a gavel. "Filed under Manhattan Family Court, case number 2379C. Richard read the top line silently, then looked at his son. 99.99%. The air split. Sloane's face drained of color. Cole's mask collapsed. "Dad, this isn't." "Enough," Richard snapped. "You humiliated her, abandoned her in a hospital bed, and tried to erase your own blood." He turned to Grace. "Miss Miller, whatever the law requires, you will have it. Those children will never want for anything again." Grace blinked back tears. "I don't want your money," she said softly. "I just want them to grow up knowing they were never a mistake." The silence that followed was heavy as judgment. Cole reached for the mic at the podium, desperate to reclaim control. "This is all lies." But the twin in the stroller let out a bright cry, cutting through his denial like sunlight through a storm cloud. Every guest turned toward the sound. Two tiny souls who didn't understand shame or power, only presence. Sloane backed away, clutching her bouquet. "You said she was gone," she whispered. Grace looked directly at Cole. "I was." The orchestra stood frozen, waiting for someone to breathe. And then, under the 1,000 glittering lights of the plaza, Grace Miller straightened her shoulders and said the words that would echo across every headline by morning. "I didn't come here to ruin your wedding, Cole. I came here to remind you what you buried." The ballroom of the Plaza Hotel stood still. Hundreds of eyes locked on Grace Miller, who had just turned the wedding of the year into a reckoning. The string quartet froze mid-song. Cameras hung mid-air. Even the chandeliers seemed to flicker, unsure whether to shine on beauty or betrayal. Cole Harrington gripped the microphone, sweat forming beneath his perfect collar. "You want attention, Grace?" he sneered, voice cracking through the speakers. "Fine. Tell them how you refused my help. Tell them how you're using those kids for sympathy." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Sloane Pierce stood behind him, frozen in her white gown, clutching her bouquet like a shield. Grace didn't move. "Help?" she repeated softly. "You mean the check and the gag order you sent to my lawyer? The one that said silence was worth $50,000? A murmur swept through the guests, whispers colliding, curiosity turning to disgust. Cole's face flushed crimson. "You're lying." Attorney Samuel Price, calm as ever, stepped forward from the edge of the stage, holding a folder. "Documented and notarized, Mr. Harrington," he said, his voice cutting like glass. "I have your lawyer's signature right here." Cole's smirk evaporated. "This isn't court." Grace took a step toward him. "No, it's a wedding, your second one." She turned toward the crowd. "And since you invited the world, let's give them the truth." She lifted a small photo, 2 NICU bracelets, each labeled Baby A and Baby B. "These are the children he left the night he promised forever," she said. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The room heard every word. "He walked out of a hospital while I was dying. He left before his sons took their first breaths." Sloane's face twisted. "Cole, tell me she's lying." But his silence was answer enough. At the front table, Richard Harrington's expression hardened. He stood slowly, his chair scraping against marble. "Enough." The single word thundered through the ballroom. "Cole, you will not weaponize deceit in my house or my name." He turned to Grace. "Miss Miller, please continue." Grace looked stunned. "Mr. Harrington, I didn't come for revenge." "I know," he said. "That's why you must speak." Cole panicked. "Dad, don't do this. You're humiliating me in front of everyone." Richard's voice sliced through him. "You humiliated yourself the day you ran from decency." The room was silent, except for the faint sound of a baby's cooing from the stroller beside Ethan Caldwell. He had stayed at the back, unseen, ensuring no one touched Grace or the twins. Now he raised his phone, signaling Samuel. A projector flickered on against the ballroom wall, court filings, timestamps, DNA results. Every proof of truth displayed under gold chandeliers. Reporters gasped, camera flashes erupted. Sloane stumbled backward, mascara streaking. "This isn't happening," she whispered. Cole lunged toward the projector, but security stepped in. Richard's men, not Grace's. "Don't embarrass yourself further," one warned. Richard faced the crowd. "My son's actions have shamed this family and our company. Effective immediately, an internal ethics review is underway." He paused, voice colder than winter. "Harrington Capital stands for integrity, not deceit." Applause erupted, small at first, then growing. The guests weren't sure who they supported, only that truth had finally cracked through the marble. Grace turned to leave, but Richard stopped her. "The children, may I?" She hesitated, then nodded. He knelt beside the stroller, his weathered face softening. "I didn't know," he whispered to the twins. "But I will now." Across the room, Sloane snapped. "I won't marry a man trending as a liar." She ripped the ring from her finger, the Tiffany diamond clattering onto marble. Cameras caught every sparkle. Cole's world caved in around him. "Sloane, wait!" But Sloane was already gone. The guests began to whisper again, this time with awe, not gossip. Grace lifted her head, the weight of years melting from her shoulders. As she turned toward the exit, one baby stirred, eyes opening just long enough to glimpse the chandeliers. Grace kissed his forehead. "It's over," she murmured. And from behind her, Richard's voice filled the silence. "No, Grace, it's only just beginning, for you, for them, and for the truth." The ballroom of the Plaza Hotel had turned into something else entirely, a courtroom dressed in gold. The champagne had gone flat, the flowers smelled too sweet, and the air carried the weight of revelation. The screen showing DNA evidence still glowed faintly, illuminating faces stunned into silence. Richard Harrington remained standing at the podium, one hand gripping a folded note, the toast he had planned to give minutes earlier. On it were words like legacy, love, pride. Now they felt like lies. He took a deep breath, glanced at the stunned guests, then at his son, Cole, whose once perfect posture had collapsed into a man half his size. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, voice deep and steady, "this toast was supposed to honor my son and his new wife, but what I've witnessed today demands a different kind of truth." The microphone hummed, all eyes fixed on him. Even Grace Miller, holding one of her babies close, looked up, unsure of what would come next. Richard continued, "In business, reputation is currency, but in family, character is everything. My son forgot that difference. He traded responsibility for comfort, love for vanity, truth for convenience." A low murmur rolled through the crowd. Cole lifted his head, whispering hoarsely, "Dad, don't do this." Richard's eyes burned with quiet fury. "You left a woman fighting for her life and called it moving on. You abandoned your children and called it a fresh start. You tried to erase what makes us human, and that, Cole, is something no fortune can restore." Gasps filled the air. Sloane Pierce, standing near the doors, flinched under the spotlight of shame. Richard reached for his Mont Blanc pen, signing a document that lay on the podium. "Effective immediately, Cole Harrington is suspended from all positions within Harrington Capital pending investigation. His accounts are frozen, his shares held in trust until he proves worthy of this family's name." Cole's voice cracked. "You can't do that." "I just did," Richard interrupted. "And you will address me not as your father, but as the man who must now clean your mess." Silence. The kind that cuts deep. Richard turned toward Grace. "Miss Miller," he said more softly, "the law will ensure you and your sons are provided for. But I owe you something words can't fix. So today, in front of everyone who once applauded my son's lies, I say this: I am sorry." Grace blinked, speechless. She hadn't come for apologies, but the sincerity in his voice broke something inside her. Sloane, desperate to escape the humiliation, hissed at Cole, "You've ruined everything." She tore off her Dior veil, threw it at his chest, and stormed out through a sea of cameras waiting at the door. Flashbulbs exploded as she pushed past them, the sound of shattered glass following her like thunder. Inside, Cole slumped into a chair, face pale. "You think this makes her a hero?" he muttered bitterly. Richard didn't even look at him. No, she doesn't need to be a hero. She just needed to survive you. The guests erupted in soft applause, not for scandal, but for closure. It was hesitant at first, then stronger, a human rhythm rising over shame. Grace stood quietly, rocking her baby as Ethan Caldwell approached. He didn't speak. He simply placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. She met his eyes and nodded, thankful, not saved. Richard lifted his glass. "To integrity," he said firmly. "To the courage it takes to tell the truth when the world would rather you stay silent. And to the woman who reminded us that dignity cannot be bought." Glasses clinked, subdued but sincere. Grace took one last look at Cole, the man who once promised her forever, and whispered, "You wanted a new life. Now you have one." Then she turned and walked toward the exit, light reflecting off the marble floor like the start of morning. The crowd parted for her, silent but reverent. Behind her, Richard placed his toast note into a champagne bucket and set it on fire. The flames curled around the word legacy until it turned to ash. And under the dying glow of chandeliers, one truth remained unshakable. Power fades, but character never does. The echo of clinking glasses had barely faded when the Plaza Hotel's ballroom emptied into chaos. Guests whispered in corners, reporters dialed their editors, and publicists fought for control of a story already spreading faster than wildfire. But deep inside the hotel, behind the gilded walls and crystal mirrors, the real battle began. In a private suite converted into a temporary boardroom, Cole Harrington slammed the door shut. His tie hung loose, his face pale and damp with sweat. "They're vultures," he hissed, pacing. "The media, Dad, even you humiliated me in front of everyone." Richard Harrington stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, calm and terrifying. "No, son," he said evenly. "You did that all by yourself." Cole's lawyer, a slick man in a navy suit, cleared his throat. "Mr. Harrington, my client wishes to countersue for defamation, public humiliation, and breach of privacy. We'll claim the DNA results were leaked without consent." Richard turned, slow and deliberate. "By all means, file it. Discovery will drag your client's text messages, spending records, and hospital footage into evidence. I'd enjoy that." The lawyer's mouth went dry. Cole glared at him. "Do something." But Richard moved first. He opened a thin leather folder and slid it across the table. "Expense reports," he said. "Company funds wired to an account registered under Sloane Pierce's boutique. You used corporate money to buy her jewelry, vacations, and that Mercedes coupe you bragged about online. Do you know what that's called, Cole?" Cole swallowed. "It's marketing." "It's embezzlement," Richard said coldly. "And now it's documented." Silence filled the room, thick and electric. Across the hotel, in a quiet lounge reserved for staff, Grace Miller sat with Ethan Caldwell and Samuel Price. Her twins rested in their strollers, finally asleep after hours of tension. Grace rubbed her temples. "Did I go too far?" Samuel shook his head. "Truth isn't too far. It's overdue." Ethan leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "He built his life on lies, Grace. You didn't destroy him. You just turned on the lights." She sighed, staring at her reflection in a silver teapot. "I never wanted revenge, just peace." Samuel checked his phone. "You're trending. Half the city thinks you're a hero. The other half calls you reckless." Grace gave a tired smile. "As long as my sons grow up knowing I didn't stay silent, I can live with that." Back in the suite, Cole lunged for the folder, but Richard placed a hand over it. "If you try to fight me publicly," he warned, "I'll hand these files to the SEC. You'll lose not only your company's shares, but your freedom." Cole collapsed into a chair, defeated. "So what now? You just hand everything to her? To that nurse?" Richard's gaze softened slightly, the faintest trace of regret. "She saved your children. She survived your cruelty. Maybe that's what this family needs, a reminder of humanity." At that moment, a knock sounded. One of Richard's aides entered, holding a silver tray with a document. "Sir, it's been executed, the support order. She's to receive immediate financial and legal protection for the children, effective tonight." Richard signed with his Mont Blanc pen and handed it back. "Deliver it to her lawyer within the hour." The aide left. Cole buried his face in his hands. "You're ruining me." "No," Richard said quietly. "I'm giving you a chance to start over, without the lies." Meanwhile, in the lounge below, Samuel's phone buzzed. He opened the message and smiled. "Court just approved the emergency order. You're officially protected, Grace." Grace's eyes filled with tears she didn't bother to hide. Ethan reached over, resting his hand gently on hers. "It's over," he said softly. She looked at him, voice trembling. "No, it's just beginning." Above them, lightning flashed beyond the hotel windows, cutting through the skyline like a warning. And in that very moment, as Cole's empire began to crumble, Grace Miller's new life, free, untouchable and unafraid, was quietly being written in the ink of justice. The storm over Manhattan had passed, leaving a quiet drizzle that streaked the windows of the Plaza Hotel. Inside, the grand ballroom looked like a battlefield of wilted roses and shattered pride. Waiters swept up broken glass while reporters lingered outside, still hoping for one more scandal to spill. But the war was already over, at least for now. In a dim side corridor, Grace Miller waited near the gilded elevator doors, her twins asleep in their carriers. Her body ached, but her soul felt strangely light, as if the air had thinned after months of suffocation. Attorney Samuel Price stood beside her, reviewing the signed support order one last time. "It's official," he said. "Full custody, child support, medical coverage, all tied to the Harrington Trust. They can't touch you anymore." Grace nodded faintly. "Can I go home now?" Before Samuel could answer, Richard Harrington approached, his silver hair still immaculate despite the chaos. "Miss Miller," he said, voice softened from command to courtesy, "I wanted to thank you for your restraint. You could have destroyed us completely." Grace met his gaze. "All I wanted was the truth. The rest destroyed itself." Richard's mouth twitched into something between shame and admiration. "Your sons will never know hunger or scandal. That's a promise." She hesitated. "They don't need your money, Mr. Harrington. They need decency." He nodded, understanding. "And perhaps that's the one thing I still have left to give." He handed her a small velvet box, heavy, elegant, wrapped in simplicity. "What is this?" she asked. "Something that should have been given months ago." She opened it slowly. Inside lay 2 Tiffany & Co. baby bracelets, identical except for the initials engraved on each, AH and BH. The sight stole her breath. "Their names?" she whispered. "Alexander and Benjamin," Richard said softly. "I thought they deserved names worthy of their fight." Tears welled, uninvited but honest. "Thank you." From behind them came the faint sound of footsteps, hurried, uneven. Cole Harrington appeared, his tuxedo undone, eyes red-rimmed and wild. "You think this makes her a saint?" he spat, voice cracking. "You're giving away my family like a corporate bonus." Richard didn't even flinch. "They were never yours to give." Cole's eyes darted toward Grace. "You think this changes anything? You'll still be just a nurse from Queens." Grace stood tall, her exhaustion replaced by something colder. "Maybe. But I'm the nurse who lived when you left her to die." He lunged toward her, but Samuel stepped between them. "Careful, Mr. Harrington. There are security cameras everywhere, and I'd love to add attempted assault to the file." Cole froze, realizing the trap. His rage deflated into a bitter laugh. "You all think you've won, but money runs out, sympathy fades, the world moves on." Richard's tone cut like glass. "Yes, but integrity doesn't." He turned his back on his son for the first time in years. "You're no longer part of this family. When you're ready to earn your name back, start by becoming a father who doesn't need lawyers to remind him of his children." Cole staggered backward, defeated. Richard looked at Grace one last time. "Good night, Miss Miller." Then he exited, leaving the weight of legacy behind him. Grace exhaled shakily, the twins stirring in their carriers. Samuel smiled. "You handled yourself like a queen." "I'm no queen," she murmured, "just a mother who refused to disappear." Ethan Caldwell appeared then, leaning against the doorway. "You disappeared into headlines," he said gently. "That's not vanishing. It's surviving." She smiled faintly. "Then maybe I'm finally done surviving." He tilted his head. "Or maybe you're just starting to live." As the elevator doors slid open, Grace stepped inside, clutching the velvet box. The gold letters on the bracelets gleamed under the dim light. Her reflection in the mirror looked different, stronger, certain, alive. And while Cole Harrington's empire was beginning to rot from the inside, Grace Miller's life, rebuilt on truth, courage, and 2 tiny heartbeats, was just beginning to bloom. Morning sunlight spilled through the tall, arched windows of the Plaza Hotel. But it couldn't wash away the shame left from the night before. The ballroom, once a temple of celebration, looked like the aftermath of a battle. Confetti trampled into marble, champagne puddles dull under pale light, and half-broken floral arches sagging like wounded pride. Cole Harrington stood among the wreckage, staring at the headlines flashing on a nearby tablet. The bride walked out. The wife returned. The truth exploded. Each headline hit like a slap. His reflection in the dark screen looked older, weaker, almost human. "Get me damage control," he barked at his assistant. "Spin it. Say it was a setup." The assistant hesitated. "Sir, your father's statement is already out. Harrington Capital confirms your suspension pending an ethics review." Cole froze. "He really did it?" The assistant nodded nervously. "And Miss Pierce canceled the honeymoon reservation. She's gone." Cole hurled a glass against the wall, shards glittering in the sunlight. "Everyone leaves eventually," he muttered. Downstairs, Grace Miller sat in a quiet lounge near the lobby. The twins dozed in their stroller, oblivious to the storm of paparazzi outside. Attorney Samuel Price sat across from her, sipping coffee. "The coverage is brutal for him," he said. "You don't need to say another word. Let the silence speak." Grace nodded slowly. "I don't want revenge to raise my sons. I want peace." Ethan Caldwell, leaning by the window, studied her face. "Peace isn't something that finds you, Grace. You build it, one choice at a time." She smiled faintly. "Then maybe today I'll start." Outside, cameras flashed as the hotel doors opened again. Richard Harrington walked through the lobby flanked by security. His expression was unreadable, but the exhaustion in his eyes betrayed the cost of truth. He approached Grace and stopped a few feet away. "Miss Miller," he began quietly, "I'm headed to a board meeting. The world will call this a scandal, but I'll call it correction. I hope that brings you some peace." "It does," Grace said, her voice calm. "For them, not for me." She gestured to the twins. "They'll never know that their first home was chaos." Richard's gaze softened. "No, they'll know they were worth fighting for." He nodded once, almost like a bow, before turning away. Upstairs, Cole poured another drink, ignoring the time. His phone buzzed with an unknown number. "What?" he snapped. A cold female voice answered. "Cole Harrington, this is Officer Ramirez with the NYPD Financial Crimes Division. We need you to come in for questioning regarding transfers to the Sloan Pierce Design Fund." His throat went dry. "That's a misunderstanding." "Then you'll have a chance to explain it," she said before hanging up. Cole stared at the screen, then at the empty ballroom. Confetti stuck to his shoes as he stumbled toward the exit, each step heavier than the last. Back downstairs, Grace rose to leave. Aunt Linda met her by the revolving doors, arms wide. "You did it, honey," she whispered, hugging her tight. "You stood up to them all." Grace held her close. "I didn't win anything, I just stopped losing." Ethan followed them out into the street. The drizzle had stopped, replaced by clear, cold air that smelled like beginning. Across Fifth Avenue, reporters called Grace's name, but she kept walking, head high, pushing the stroller toward the light. Behind her, the plaza stood like a wounded monument, its gold trim dull, its grandeur hollow. Inside, a janitor swept up confetti mixed with tears and broken glass. Someone had left behind a single Tiffany ring box, empty and forgotten. Grace glanced back once, her reflection shimmering in the glass doors, strong, steady, unbreakable. And as the city moved on, the woman once left to die walked into her next chapter. Not a victim of betrayal, but the author of her own rebirth. The morning after the wedding scandal, New York pulsed with noise. Horns, headlines, gossip. Screens in coffee shops, subway stations, and Times Square all flashed the same image. Grace Miller standing under the chandeliers of the Plaza Hotel, her twins beside her, her expression calm while chaos exploded around her. The caption beneath read, "The abandoned wife who spoke the truth." Inside Ethan Caldwell's downtown office, sunlight poured through glass walls. Grace sat across from him at a sleek table, the twins asleep in their stroller beside her. "I didn't mean for it to go viral," she said softly. "I just wanted them to know the truth." Ethan smiled gently. "You can't control truth once it's free, but you can control what comes next." He turned his laptop toward her. A draft statement prepared by Samuel Price, the lawyer who had guided her through every storm. The headline read, "A Mother's Request for Decency." Grace read aloud, her voice steady. "For the sake of my children, I ask for privacy and peace. I am grateful to the Harrington Foundation for ensuring my son's future, and to those who showed kindness when the world turned cruel. There are no winners in betrayal, only lessons." She looked up. "It's simple, honest." Samuel nodded. That's why it will work. It closes the door on their circus and opens one for your dignity. Ethan added, we'll release it at noon. Every outlet will pick it up. You'll have the final word. At exactly 12 p.m., Grace pressed send. Within minutes, the internet changed its tone. Reporters who once chased scandal now praised her grace. Hashtags like strength in silence and grace not gossip trended across social media. News anchors replayed her calm demeanor instead of Cole's rage. Meanwhile, in a dim penthouse on Fifth Avenue, Cole Harrington watched it all unfold. His apartment was half empty now, the remnants of luxury feeling more like evidence than comfort. She's turning herself into a saint, he muttered, scrolling through comments that called her a symbol of modern resilience. His phone buzzed, a message from Sloane Pierce. Don't contact me again, I'm done being part of your scandal. He threw the phone across the room. It landed beside an open Tiffany box, still empty. Across town, Richard Harrington sat in a boardroom, surrounded by senior executives. The press conference cameras were ready. He adjusted his tie and spoke clearly. Effective immediately, Cole Harrington has resigned from all roles within Harrington Capital. Our company will establish a fund for single parents facing medical abandonment cases. Integrity must be lived, not performed. Applause filled the room, but Richard didn't smile. For all his wealth, his greatest fortune now rested in redemption, not numbers. At home in Queens, Aunt Linda brewed coffee while Grace watched the news in disbelief. The anchor's voice was calm. In a rare act of accountability, the Harrington family has publicly apologized. Sources confirm child support payments have been secured through a legal trust. Linda chuckled. See? You shook the world without shouting. Grace smiled, rocking one of the twins. Maybe that's how real power sounds. That evening, she received a call from an unknown number. When she answered, Richard's voice filled the line. You did something remarkable today, Miss Miller. You reminded people that decency still matters. Grace hesitated. I didn't do it for headlines, sir. I did it because silence can be cruel. He paused. Then we share the same lesson. After hanging up, she sat by the window watching lights bloom across the skyline. Ethan arrived quietly, holding a small paper bag. Dinner, he said. You forgot to eat. She smiled. You don't have to keep showing up. He looked at her for a long moment. I know, that's why I'm here. Outside, New York moved on, its towers glimmering with stories of ambition, betrayal, and survival. But in one quiet apartment above a bodega in Queens, a woman who had been left to die now held her sons and whispered, We're free. And for the first time since the storm, freedom didn't feel like an escape. It felt like home. Monday morning arrived cold and merciless. The glass towers of Park Avenue shimmered in the winter light, their reflections slicing the skyline like knives. Inside the 48th floor boardroom of Harrington Capital, the aftermath of scandal took human form. Men in dark suits, women with sharp eyes, and one empty chair at the head of the table where Cole Harrington used to sit. Richard Harrington stood at the window, his reflection split by glass and city. Let's begin, he said. The air stiffened. Our family name has been dragged through tabloids. But the difference between shame and redemption, he paused, turning slowly, is action. He gestured to the compliance director, who projected a spreadsheet of wire transfers and invoices across the screen. These, she said, voice steady, were unauthorized corporate expenses, luxury items purchased under marketing codes, all signed by Cole Harrington. A murmur rippled around the table. Richard didn't blink. Freeze the accounts, he ordered. Notify the auditors, and issue a statement. Harrington Capital stands for transparency. Starting today. Someone whispered, What about Cole? Richard exhaled through his nose. He'll face the consequences, same as any employee. His tone left no room for bloodlines or pity. Meanwhile, in a smaller world, far from skyscrapers, Grace Miller pushed open the staff door of New York Presbyterian Hospital. She was back in scrubs again, hair tied, stethoscope cold against her neck. The nurse's station smelled of coffee and antiseptic. Welcome home, said Dr. Maya Chen, smiling. Grace smiled back, tucking her badge into place. Feels like home. During her break, she found a plain envelope in her locker with her name printed neatly. Inside was a new contract. Full-time employment, flexible hours, and a small grant from the Caldwell Foundation for Single Parents in Healthcare. A note was attached in familiar handwriting. You didn't just survive, Grace. You inspired. Keep going. E.C. Her eyes stung. but she smiled. Across town, Cole sat in a midtown cafe, hat pulled low, sunglasses failing to hide the fall from Grace. He scrolled through his phone. Calls unanswered, invitations revoked, messages from former friends, now reading seen. The waitress placed a check beside his half-empty cup. "You want anything else?" He shook his head. "No, not anymore." At that same moment, Richard entered the Harrington Capital boardroom again, this time holding a folder labeled Employee Welfare Initiative. "This," he said to his executives, "isn't about image, it's about conscience." He announced the launch of a new trust, a program supporting NICU families, single parents, and women facing medical abandonment. "It's the least we can do to make amends." The room erupted in quiet approval. For the first time in years, Richard felt something heavier than power: peace. Back at the hospital, Ethan Caldwell arrived at the lobby carrying 2 lattes. "They said you're back," he said with a smile. Grace took the coffee, laughing softly. "I should be the one thanking you, not the other way around." He leaned against the counter. "You've done enough thanking. Maybe now you just live." Before she could reply, Samuel Price entered, phone in hand. "Breaking news," he said. "Cole's been officially suspended. The SEC's investigating the transfers. Looks like his freedom might come with an orange jumpsuit." Grace sighed. "I don't want him in prison, Samuel." He tilted his head. "You want justice, not revenge. There's a difference." Ethan added, "And justice already found him." Later that evening, as the city glowed with lights, Grace returned home to Aunt Linda, rocking the twins. Dinner simmered on the stove, the air filled with warmth that money couldn't buy. Linda looked up. "You did good today." Grace brushed a tear from her cheek. For once, it wasn't about fighting, it was just living. Outside, snow began to fall over Manhattan, blanketing the chaos of the past in soft silence. And somewhere in the distance, inside a quiet apartment stripped of luxury, Cole Harrington stared at his reflection and finally understood that losing everything was the first honest thing he'd ever done. Autumn swept across Central Park, turning the trees into gold and rust. Grace Miller pushed a double stroller along the winding paths, her twins bundled in tiny jackets. The crisp air carried the scent of roasted chestnuts and fallen leaves. It was her first real day off since returning to work, and for once, she wasn't hurrying anywhere. The chaos was behind her, at least most of it. She stopped at a small bench near the lake, the skyline gleaming in the distance. Aunt Linda joined her with 2 paper cups from Starbucks, handing one over. "You realize, honey, you're on magazine covers now?" she teased. "They call you the nurse who faced the empire." Grace laughed softly. "I'm not an empire fighter. I'm just a mom who didn't quit," Linda grinned. "That's what makes it a story." As they talked, a familiar voice approached from behind. "Hope I'm not interrupting the queens of Central Park," Ethan Caldwell said, smiling. He carried a small bag from a bakery and a modest bouquet of daisies, nothing extravagant but thoughtful. "You didn't have to," Grace said. "I know," he replied. "That's why I did." He sat beside her, eyes on the twins. "They look stronger every time I see them." "They're starting to crawl," she said proudly. "I can't leave the room for 10 seconds without chaos." "That's life," Ethan said quietly. "Beautiful, exhausting chaos." Silence fell between them, the good kind. Grace sipped her coffee, watching the reflection of skyscrapers shimmer on the water. "Sometimes I still wake up thinking I'm in that hospital," she admitted. "Everything dark, beeping, and empty. And then I hear them breathing beside me and I remember, I made it." Ethan turned toward her. "You didn't just make it, you rebuilt yourself from nothing." Before she could answer, her phone buzzed. Samuel Price's name flashed across the screen. She answered quickly. "Grace, it's done," he said. "The court finalized everything this morning. You have sole custody and full control of the trust accounts. Cole signed under consent to avoid criminal charges. It's over." She closed her eyes. "Thank you, Samuel." When she hung up, Ethan asked, "Good news?" "The best kind," she said. "Freedom on paper." He smiled. "And what about freedom in here?" He tapped his chest lightly. Grace looked down at the twins, then back at him. "That's still a work in progress." Meanwhile, in a small downtown apartment, Cole Harrington sat by the window, staring at a stack of unopened letters. His once perfect hair was disheveled, his face unshaven. The Mercedes was gone, the penthouse sold, and the world had stopped calling. His only companion was silence, and the faint sound of his father's voice on the news, speaking about integrity and rebuilding. Cole turned off the TV. The irony was suffocating. Back in the park, Ethan checked his watch. I have a meeting in 20 minutes, a tech incubator uptown, but I'd rather stay here. Go, Grace said with a laugh. The world needs good men in boardrooms. He stood, hesitant. How about dinner this weekend? Something simple. No reporters, no cameras, just food and breathing. Grace hesitated, heart skipping. Dinner sounds nice, Ethan grinned. It's a date then? As he walked away, Linda elbowed her niece. He's not just nice, you know, he's solid. Grace smiled, blushing slightly. I know. The twins stirred, one letting out a soft giggle. She leaned over, brushing a kiss on each tiny forehead. The wind lifted a few leaves around her, and for the first time in a long time, the sound of the city felt like music. The skyline rose before her, not a reminder of what she'd lost, but proof of how far she'd come. And somewhere beyond those towers, the man who once abandoned her was learning the cost of arrogance, while Grace Miller was finally learning the beauty of peace. The chill of late November settled over Manhattan as Grace Miller arrived at the New York County Supreme Court. The twins stayed home with Aunt Linda, leaving her hands free but her heart heavy. She stood at the courthouse steps, looking up at the gray stone columns that rose like judges themselves. Every echo of her heels across the marble floor reminded her why she was there. Not for vengeance, but for truth. Inside the courtroom buzzed with whispers. Reporters lined the benches, notebooks ready, while lawyers exchanged wary glances. At the far end sat Cole Harrington, his once tailored world now threadbare. His suit hung looser, his eyes hollow, the shine of arrogance replaced by fatigue. When Grace entered, his jaw tightened. He didn't look at her. He couldn't. Judge Rosenthal, a woman with iron gray hair and an expression carved from experience, adjusted her glasses. This hearing is to finalize custody, support, and pending civil claims between Mr. Cole Harrington and Ms. Grace Miller. The gavel struck once. Attorney Samuel Price rose first. Your Honor, the evidence before the court demonstrates abandonment, financial neglect, and reputational harm to my client, all documented and substantiated. Miss Miller isn't asking for revenge, only responsibility. The judge nodded. Proceed. Samuel clicked a remote. On the screen appeared hospital footage. Grace pale and unconscious, doctors rushing, monitors beeping. Then another clip. Cole stepping into an elevator that night, glancing at his phone before the doors closed. Cole's lawyer stood abruptly. Objection. That footage violates privacy. Judge Rosenthal raised a hand. Overruled. The truth doesn't embarrass the innocent. Samuel continued. My client delivered 2 children alone while her husband dined across town with another woman. She rebuilt her life without his help, without his name, and without his lies. Today we're asking the court to recognize her rights as the sole legal guardian of Alexander and Benjamin Harrington. Grace looked down, her breath trembling. Cole finally spoke, his voice a brittle whisper. I made mistakes, but I've tried to make amends. I've signed the support documents. I've offered visitation. I just want to see my sons. Samuel turned sharply. You had 9 months to see them, Mr. Harrington. You chose press releases instead. The courtroom fell silent. The judge leaned forward. Mr. Harrington, why now? Cole hesitated, eyes darting to the cameras. Because I want to be better. Grace's voice broke the silence. You want to be better because the world saw you fall. Her tone was calm but full of weight. You don't get to learn fatherhood from headlines, Cole. You learn it from nights without sleep, from rocking babies who don't know who you are. You walked away from that. Cole's mouth opened, then closed. No defense came. Judge Rosenthal exhaled. The court finds sufficient evidence of neglect and emotional harm. Custody is granted solely to Ms. Miller. Mr. Harrington will retain supervised visitation after completing parenting and therapy programs. Child support payments are ordered as stipulated by the trust agreement. The gavel struck twice. Final. Grace felt tears rising, not from triumph but relief. Samuel touched her shoulder. It's over, he whispered. Across the aisle, Cole slumped, his lawyer packing silent defeat into a briefcase. Cameras flashed as the bailiff called for order, but Grace didn't stay to hear the noise. She gathered her coat and walked out into the hallway, the cold air meeting her like a friend. Outside, Ethan Caldwell waited on the courthouse steps, holding a paper bag. Turkey sandwiches, he said, smiling softly. You didn't eat breakfast. She laughed weakly. You're becoming a habit. He shrugged. Some habits are good for you. They sat on the steps, sharing food while the city roared around them. For a long moment, neither spoke. Grace looked up at the skyline, eyes bright with something new. Peace, maybe, or the fragile start of hope. Behind them, Cole exited the courthouse, surrounded by cameras, his name now a cautionary tale. And as the snow began to fall, Grace Miller realized she hadn't just won a case. She'd reclaimed her life, her voice, and her tomorrow. The first snow of December dusted New York City, turning streets into quiet rivers of light. 9 months had passed since that stormy night at New York Presbyterian Hospital, the night Grace Miller almost died, bringing 2 lives into the world. Now she was back in the same building. But this time, she wasn't a patient. She was the voice. A camera crew from the hospital's foundation set up lights in the neonatal wing. Nurses whispered with pride, remembering her story. Grace sat in a simple chair, no makeup, her blue scrubs freshly pressed. The backdrop was soft, tiny cribs, pastel walls, and the faint hum of machines that once kept her sons alive. The producer adjusted her mic. "We'll just talk naturally, Grace," she said. "Tell your story the way it happened." Grace smiled faintly. "The truth doesn't need special effects." When the camera's red light blinked on, she began. 9 months ago, I was on this floor, thinking I wouldn't make it. My husband had left, my body was failing, and all I could do was pray for 2 heartbeats stronger than mine. Those heartbeats saved me. She paused, swallowing emotion. This isn't a story about betrayal, it's a story about survival, about what love looks like when no one's watching. Her words were simple, but they pierced through screens. The video, titled "The Truth About Deathbeds," was uploaded to the hospital's social media page that evening. By midnight, it had over 5 million views. Comments flooded in, nurses, mothers, strangers thanking her for reminding them that strength didn't always roar. Dr. Maya Chen appeared beside her after the shoot, smiling proudly. "You gave people more than a story. You gave them permission to heal." Grace laughed softly. "I just told the truth." Maya nodded, and truth is rare currency. Across town, in a cramped apartment that smelled of regret, Cole Harrington watched the video on an old tablet. He looked older than his 31 years, a shadow of the man who once ruled boardrooms. As Grace's face appeared on screen, calm, radiant, whole, his eyes filled with something unfamiliar, humility. When she said, "He left me on my deathbed," he closed the tablet and whispered, "I know." In the days that followed, the hospital received an influx of donations. The Harrington Foundation, now under Richard's management, pledged to expand the NICU in Grace's name. Reporters called her the mother who rebuilt hope. She ignored the titles, focusing instead on bottles, bedtime, and the tiny laughter that filled her Queens apartment. One evening, Grace returned home from a late shift to find Ethan Caldwell waiting at her door, snowflakes clinging to his coat. "You're impossible to reach," he teased. She smiled, unlocking the door. "That's because you keep calling during feeding time." He stepped inside, setting down a bag from the River Cafe. "Dinner, no excuses." As they ate on the couch, Ethan pulled out his phone. "You're trending again," he said. Grace groaned. "Please tell me it's not another headline." He grinned. "No scandal, just this. Grace Miller, the woman who turned her deathbed into a beginning." She rolled her eyes. "Dramatic." "True," he countered. The twins babbled from their playpen, their voices tiny but full of life. Grace watched them for a moment, her heart swelling with gratitude and disbelief. "Sometimes I still can't believe we made it here," she said softly. Ethan leaned closer. "Believe it. You didn't just survive, Grace. You resurrected." She laughed quietly. "Resurrected? That's a little biblical." He smiled. "So is forgiveness." Outside, snow fell thicker now, the city's noise muffled under a white hush. Grace glanced toward the window, her reflection merging with the night. "I used to think the night I almost died was the end of me," she said. "Now I know. It was just the start." Ethan nodded, raising his glass of wine. "To starts." Grace touched her glass to his. "To peace." And as laughter mingled with the sound of her children's breathing, the camera of life panned back one last time, capturing not the hospital lights, not the chandeliers of the plaza, but a small apartment in Queens, where grace, love, and truth had finally found their home. The winter sun crept slowly across Brooklyn Bridge, glinting off the frozen East River. The city was waking up to another ordinary morning, but for Grace Miller, nothing about this day felt ordinary. It had been almost a year since her storm, since the night that nearly ended everything. The court battles were over, the headlines had faded, and the chaos had finally gone quiet. But something new was stirring, something softer, scarier, peace. She stood outside the River Cafe, wrapped in her old gray coat, waiting for Ethan Caldwell. Her fingers toyed with a locket that hung around her neck, a small silver one he had given her months ago, holding pictures of her sons. The twins were at home with Aunt Linda, their laughter echoing faintly through the phone when she'd left. The door opened, and there he was, Ethan, in a navy wool coat, carrying a small paper bag and that familiar calm in his eyes. "You're early," he said with a grin. "I didn't want to be late for a man who saved me with coffee more times than I can count," she teased. He laughed, pulling out 2 steaming cups from the bag. "Starbucks. Tradition." They walked to a corner table by the window, the Manhattan skyline glittering across the water. The waiter poured water, and Ethan ordered their usual, simple, quiet, real. "How's work?" he asked. Grace smiled. "Busy. I've been mentoring 2 new nurses. Maya says I'm turning into her." "That's not a bad thing," Ethan said. "Maya saved your life." Grace nodded. "And maybe she saved more than that." For a moment they sat in comfortable silence, the city beyond them humming like a lullaby. Then Ethan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small blue box. But it wasn't Tiffany. No diamonds, no spotlight. He placed it on the table and said softly, "Before you panic, it's not what you think." Grace raised an eyebrow. "That's not fair. You can't say that after pulling out a blue box." He smiled. "It's a locket, the same design as yours, but with 2 empty frames, for the next memories you want to make. I figured you'd decide who or what belongs inside." Grace opened it carefully, her breath catching. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Ethan's gaze was steady. "I'm not here to rewrite your past, Grace. I just want to be in your future, if that's something you'd ever want." Her heart swelled with a mix of fear and warmth. "You know, I used to think love meant sacrifice, losing yourself for someone else. And now?" he asked. "Now I think love is the opposite. It's finding yourself again, and letting someone witness it." Ethan smiled, "The kind that reaches the soul. Then maybe all I'm asking is to be that witness." Outside, snowflakes began to fall again, swirling like the soft applause of the universe. Grace looked at the skyline, remembering every place she'd cried, fought, and survived. "I've spent so long fighting storms," she said quietly. "Maybe it's time to walk in the calm." Ethan reached across the table, his hand brushing hers. "You already are." Back in Queens, Aunt Linda sent her a photo. Both twins in matching pajamas, one holding a wooden spoon like a sword, the other covered in cereal. Grace laughed through tears. "My world," she said softly. Ethan leaned over, looking at the photo. "Then I guess dinner will have to include 4 seats." Grace met his eyes. "You'd sit through flying oatmeal?" He grinned. "For you? I'd bring goggles." They both laughed, the kind of laughter that healed more than words. Later, as they walked out onto the pier, the wind cold but kind, Ethan stopped and looked at her. "Grace, when the time feels right, when you're ready, maybe we could write a new story. Not the tragic one the world told, but the real one. The quiet one." Grace looked at him, heart steady for the first time in years. "We already started it," she said. And under the silver sky, with the city glowing behind them and the river whispering below, Grace Miller realized that love wasn't about what you lose. It was about what survives after the storm. Spring sunlight spilled across Fifth Avenue, catching on the windows of the conservatory garden in Central Park. The air was soft, touched with the scent of lilacs. Inside, under a canopy of pale wisteria, a small crowd gathered. No press, no chandeliers, no luxury displays. Just faces that mattered. Aunt Linda, Dr. Maya Chen, Attorney Samuel Price, and a handful of nurses who'd once stood beside Grace when the world seemed to end. At the front stood Grace Miller, her hair down for the first time anyone could remember, her dress simple ivory, no veil, no diamonds, just sunlight. Beside her, Ethan Caldwell waited with quiet awe in his eyes. He wasn't a billionaire today, not a headline or a foundation name. He was just a man who'd stayed, who'd listened, who'd helped her rebuild without ever asking to own the pieces. The twins, now toddling on shaky legs, wore tiny bow ties that kept twisting sideways. When one tripped, the crowd chuckled, and Ethan bent down to steady him. Grace smiled, an image of home, not perfection. Maya Chen stepped forward as the officiant. We stand here today, she began, not to celebrate a fairy tale, but to honor something rarer, the courage to love again after pain. This is not a beginning, but a continuation. Grace met Ethan's gaze, her heart full. He whispered, "You sure you're ready for this?" She grinned. "I've never been more sure of anything." Maya nodded toward her. "Grace, would you like to say your vows?" Grace took a breath. Her voice was steady, every word grounded in the journey behind her. "I once believed love was a promise you could lose, but you taught me that real love doesn't rescue, it reminds you who you are. I don't need a savior, I just need someone who stays." She smiled, tears bright but peaceful. "Thank you for staying." Ethan's throat tightened. "You didn't need saving, Grace. You needed someone to see the fire in you, and to never walk away from its warmth." He paused. "So I promise this. No storms will make me run. No silence will make me doubt. You don't have to be perfect for me to stay." The words fell into the spring air like a benediction. Maya smiled. "Then, by the power vested in me and the state of New York, I pronounce you partners in life, equal in heart, purpose, and courage." Applause rippled through the small crowd as Ethan leaned forward, kissed her gently, and the city seemed to breathe again. Later, under the shade of blooming cherry trees, Aunt Linda clinked glasses of sparkling cider. "To the nurse who made millionaires cry," she joked. Grace laughed, wiping her eyes. "To the aunt who made sure I never quit." Samuel raised his glass next. "To justice, and to knowing when to walk away from courtrooms and toward happiness." Maya added softly, "To the lives saved, not just in the hospital, but in the quiet after." Grace looked around at them, every person who'd held her up when the ground vanished. Her heart ached with gratitude. Across town, Cole Harrington stood outside a community center, wearing a volunteer badge. The tabloids had stopped following him months ago. He swept floors, delivered food, avoided cameras. But sometimes, when he heard the laughter of children echo through the hall, he'd stop and stare, remembering what his arrogance had cost him. His punishment wasn't prison. It was watching the world move on without him. Back in the garden, the twins toddled toward Grace, holding hands. She bent down, scooped them up, kissed both foreheads. "Mommy's happy now," she whispered. Ethan slipped his arm around her waist. Together they watched the skyline shimmer beyond the trees, Manhattan rising like a promise. Grace took a deep breath of spring air, warm and new. "For the first time," she said softly, "it feels like morning." Ethan smiled. "That's because it is." And as sunlight filtered through wisteria, laughter rose, gentle and unguarded. The story that began with a storm ended not in revenge or regret, but in redemption. A quiet, powerful kind of peace that only love after loss can bring. Because sometimes justice sounds like forgiveness, and sometimes the ending is simply a new beginning dressed in morning light. So that's how our story ends, not with revenge, but with peace. You're still here, right? That means something in this story has touched your heart in a quiet way. Maybe you've been through your own kind of storm, or maybe you've loved someone who forgot how to stay. But like Grace, you've seen that even broken things can shine again. There's a quote from the Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius that says, "The obstacle is the way." Every pain, every betrayal, every night you thought would never end, it was never the end. It was the beginning of the person you were meant to become. Healing isn't loud. It's choosing peace when you have every reason to fight. It's forgiving, not because they deserve it, but because you deserve rest. So if this story found you tonight, let it remind you that you are stronger than your heartbreak, wiser than your mistakes, and still worthy of love that stays. If Grace's journey touched you even a little, please like, share, and subscribe. Not just for more stories, but because maybe, just maybe, your next chapter begins right here.